This is Think Smart with TMFG, your weekly podcast of what's newsworthy and relevant to everyday Canadians, with your host, Senior Financial Advisor Rob McClelland, and Mike Connon of Assante Capital Management. This week on Think Smart with McClelland Financial Group, we are going to be discussing, is it true that the wealthy individuals in this country don't pay enough income tax? Mike, I got the idea for this podcast from an article that was written in the Globe and Mail. It was an opinion piece by Fred Iridian back in early May. And he had written the article because of the recent changes to the capital inclusion rate that the government is proposing to introduce, where the inclusion rate will go from what was a 50% inclusion rate to a 67% inclusion rate for individuals and for corporations on any capital gains. So I thought what I would do here is take some of the evidence that Fred had presented, which is looking at how much tax do the wealthy really pay. And so we'll start with, the first one. How do you define wealthy? Well, I think someone who is wealthy or is earning a great income, they're probably taxed at the top marginal rate in this country.
Close to 54% now, isn't it?
It's 53.5%. And so what that means is each additional dollar, the government's going to keep 53.5%, and you get 46.5%. So there's a big gap there once you get over that 53%.
So who are these wealthy?
Well, we're going to go to the super wealthy first. And so that's the 0.01%. It's not the 1%. It's not the 10%. It's 0.01%. So those are people who are extremely wealthy and typically have great incomes. So what's that income look like, Mike?
I had a note. It said income is $2,085,000 to $2,086,000 per year. So that's a pretty high income, isn't it?
Pretty good, making $2 million every year, or roughly every year. And what are they paying in taxes?
On average, they pay about $911,000 in taxes. About 43.7% of everything they make goes to, let's say, income tax.
Okay. So when we look at that, the 43% is not the marginal rate. It's the average rate of taxes they pay. The marginal rate is what they would pay if they earned an additional dollar. So if they earned an additional $100,000 on top of that $2 million, they would give up $53,000 in income tax. So that's how it works. So let's look at that individual. Those are the top 0.01%, the most wealthy in the country. How much are they paying? We know they're paying on average a little over $900,000 each.
Yep. What
are they paying in total?
Well, it gives them about $1.174 million to spend, which is quite a deal to be able to spend. But you remember, there's tax on everything they spend now. If they're going to use that for anything, now they're going to pay tax on, if you're going to do purchases, you're going to pay 13%, basically HST on whatever you buy. And if you buy luxury goods, there's even additional tax on top of that too. So they're going to have a pretty heavy tax rate.
I like to look at it as, how much income tax is collected in this country. And the number's roughly $300 billion from all Canadians that's collected every year. This group of 0.01% are paying almost 9% of that. They're paying just under $30 billion of that 300. So that's a pretty high amount of tax that they're paying. Everyone likes to think that those people making $2 million aren't paying any tax. That's not the case at all.
Yeah, tax rates in Canada are very unfriendly as soon as you start to enter into the higher net worth situation. More unfriendly than a lot of other countries out there.
Let's go to the next group. So the next group, we're going to go to the top 1%. And the top 1%, believe it or not, they pay 22.5% of all income taxes in the country, which means the other 99% of the population pay the other, call it 76, 77% of income tax. They earn about 10% of the income, but they pay 22% of the taxes. That's a big gap. So it's a ratio of income versus taxes of about 2.2.
It's 2.2 beyond the average, too. That's not compared to someone with low income. That's the average taxpayer.
Yep. So we've looked at the top 1%. We've also looked at the 0.01 of 1%. Let's go down to the next group, the top 10%. And in many cases, those are people that we all talk about, the top 10% or the top 1%. Those are the wealthy in this country.
Yeah.
They're making, over $250,000 a year. And how much are they actually paying in tax?
Well, they pay about 54% of all taxes. So if you take the top 10% of Canadians, 54.4% of all taxes are paid by those people. They earn 34% of the income in the country, but again, pay 54% of the taxes. So there's about 1.6 times ratio of taxes to income that are being paid. So are they covering their fair share? It seems so.
Well, I always like to flip it around. So the other 90% of the population's only paying 45.5% of the taxes. And so what the government's trying to do is to collect even more taxes from that top 10%, which will make the equation even smaller. Maybe the top 10% will be paying 50 or 60%, I guess, of all taxes.
Yeah.
That seems to be getting a little bit heavy, but I'm not in the government, luckily. Also remember, when we're looking at the top 10%, we're including the top 1% and the top 0.01%. So it's a bigger group than you would realize.
And we talk about this top, let's say, 0.01%. What do they do? Do they just sit in castles?
Well, that's the impression I think a lot of people have, that most of them don't work. Maybe it's passive income. The truth is, actually, even the 0.01%, even the wealthiest in this country, of the $2 million of income, $1.4 million, or about 70% of that, comes from employment. They're working. Now, maybe they're working in their own company, they own their own business, but they're not sitting back and just collecting income.
It's funny, we've realized this over years of doing financial plans with people. A lot of retired folks with generally a good portfolio don't pay a lot of tax. Like, there's a lot of people with a few $1 million in a portfolio that are paying very, very low tax. They're paying probably about, out of income, they might be in a 10% of their income tax bracket. And it's shocking how much that happens, but that's the reality of how the tax system works. But if you're earning income, you're definitely paying tax at a high rate.
I think one of the things that happens here is it's politically easier to say tax the rich. You certainly don't want to tax the middle class.
Well, the trick is it's 0.01% of the votes,
right?
I mean,
right?
That's the reality.
So
right?
you're not losing that many votes.
We're in a democracy.
You might know some of the people whose votes you're losing.
You can't buy your votes.
So
the richest guy in the world gets one vote and someone on the street gets one vote. So that's how it works.
What about, why don't they go after the retirees and tax them more? Because if you said, we have many retired clients that earn $200,000 worth of income and pay $20,000 in income tax.
And you won't get in. Lobby groups for retirees. It's the number one, the baby boomers come around. So baby boomers are the retirees now, and they represent a large percentage of the population. If you go against them, you won't be in government for very long.
Let's do a quick summary on what we've learned so far. So overall, the government collects about $300 billion in income tax every year, or at least that's back in 2021. The top 0.01 pay 27 of that billion dollars, or 9%. We could now go down to the next group, the top 1%. They pay 68 billion, or 23% of the taxes. And the top 10% of income earners pay 163 of the 300 billion, or 54%. The remaining 90% of the population, $137 billion, or 46% of all the taxes.
Not a bad deal.
That's a pretty good deal. It's interesting, and I've got to be careful on how I word this, but I was in a discussion, I was down in the U.S. traveling, and I was talking to an American resident, lives in the States, and I mentioned that I was from Canada, and he goes, "Oh, you've got a socialist government."
Yeah, it's a bad word down there.
Well, I never thought we'd become socialist. I didn't realize we'd become the outside world views us as being socialist.
Yep.
Which means everybody's treated the same.
Yep. Socialism is one step away from communism in the States.
Well, and, if we have a look at, I'm not going to name any countries, but we can look that communism hasn't exactly worked in the world. And democracy, they say, is the worst form of government, but it's
better than everything else.
Yep. So it may be the right approach. If we look just at what's going on in this country, most of our new immigrants coming in are often leaving socialist countries. Yeah. And yet the outside world thinks we're becoming one just like that. Is it different to be wealthy? What will the wealthy do if they're taxed at 60% or 65%? If we keep raising that bar?
Well, they move to countries that don't have that tax rate. That's the one difficult part. It's funny, and I know a lot of people don't. I look at all the super wealthy in the States. It's easier to talk about those people because they're very well known. The Elon Musks, back in the Steve Jobs days, and the Bill Gates in the world. And I've looked at what they've done with their wealth. It's not that they're out enjoying life on, I'm sure they have a good life, but they employ hundreds and thousands of people. They have made a better life for us over this time. And I'd rather have Bill Gates reinvest in my money than the government reinvest in my money. He seems to have a great mind on what he can do with that. Think of everything we see. Think of AI and everything that we're watching. That's all stemmed, from research that's been done over years by these geniuses who continue to reinvest their money. And they'll do a better job than the governments. Governments have never invented anything. Governments have a very important purpose. I'm not anti-government or anything like that, but governments don't invent anything. They don't tend to make the world a better place. These people do tend to do that.
Let's look at the repercussions if the wealthy decide to move. And I'll use an example. I was reading an article this morning about what's going on with some of the wealthy Americans. So if you live in New York City and you work in New York City, you pay the most taxes anywhere. So what a lot of wealthy executives have figured out, they have to come under 180 days living in New York City. And how is it counted? At the end of the day, if by midnight you're in New York City, then that counts as a day in New York City.
Yep.
The flights that leave at 11 p.m. at night to get you back to your estate are huge. People have staff that count every minute someone spends in that state, all with the design to reduce the amount of income tax you're going to pay. And that's what I mean. The wealthy are different than you and I. They're going to come up with creative ideas. Maybe they move their corporation outside of Canada, outside of America, if we start taxing too much. I'm not saying they shouldn't pay a lot of taxes. They absolutely need to and should. But you can go past a tipping point, and it's very dangerous. Lots of companies have tried to move to Ireland.
Yep.
All because they want to pay less income tax. They're truly an American or a Canadian company, but they're taxed overseas.
Ireland was big, then Poland came in to be big. And you watch the doctors. It's very difficult to keep a doctor in Canada now. They graduate, and there's just, number one, there's more pay in the U.S., and again, there's lower tax in the U.S., which is tough to compete against.
Let's touch on what's going to be the impact on corporations with this capital inclusion rate. So the big difference in this proposed tax solution is that individuals will have that first $250,000 of capital gains. That'll be at the lower inclusion rate of 50%. For corporations, they don't get that first 253 at lower. They immediately, as of June 25th, will go to roughly 67% capital inclusion rate. So what are some of the impacts? And I went through this. One of them is they're going to change on how they invest. In theory, their bottom line has changed. They're going to pay more in income tax. So if you're a business owner, you don't want to make less profit after tax.
Yep.
Your goal is to at least make the same as you made last year and make maybe even a little more. So if the government's come in and changed the rules and now you're going to be paying more in income tax, you got to either increase your income or reduce your expenses. So the first thing they could do is raise prices.
Yep.
I run a corporation. I can raise prices. What's the government trying to do now?
Yeah. Lower inflation.
Lower inflation. This is going to be inflationary. The only option people have to do is raise prices or reduce expenses.
Reduce expenses, cutting employees. That creates unemployment. Some
of the benefactors in this country, all the charities, get a lot of their money from donations. If suddenly a corporation's making less money, less profit, they're going to reduce their charitable contributions. It's a natural thing. If they were giving 3% of their profits to charities before, that may drop to 1.5%. That's going to have a bigger impact on government. So now those charities have nowhere to turn but to government.
Yep.
Government, can you help us out? Otherwise, the charity's going to have to close, or else we won't be able to help as many people.
Well, I know we'll get a lot of feedback on this podcast, and if people disagree, we're quite welcome to hear your comments in the comment section. So it'd be interesting to see what people have to say.
2 other thoughts. Lower profits will lead to, in this country, will lead to lower stock prices because stock prices are driven by profits.
Yep.
So if we have lower profits for Canadian companies, how is that going to work for Canadians with retirement plans?
Yeah, well, lower stock prices means retirement plans won't work out as well and pension plans won't have as much money. And pension plans are just investments. So if stock prices don't work out that well, those pension plans are going to pay the price.
Another impact could be less investments in the business. If there's less profits at the end of each year because of taxes, the companies who invest a lot of money back into their business won't be able to put as much money back into the business. That's going to impact jobs.
Less expansion, higher unemployment.
It's a complicated issue. We're not going to solve it today, but I think it's important to know all the things that could be impacted by this change in the capital inclusion rate. That brings us to the end of another week. This is Rob and Mike with Think Smart from the McClelland Financial Group, reminding you to subscribe so that you can have your best retirement ever.
You've been listening to the McClelland Financial Group of Assante Capital Management Limited. Assante Capital Management Limited is a member of the Canadian Investor Protection Fund and the Investment Industry Regulatory Organization of Canada. Insurance products and services are provided through Assante Estate and Insurance Services Incorporated. This material is provided for general information and is subject to change without notice. Every effort has been made to compile this material from reliable sources. However, no warranty can be made as to its accuracy or completeness. Before acting on any of the previous information, please make sure to see a professional advisor for individual financial advice based on your personal circumstances. The opinions expressed are those of the authors and not necessarily those of Assante Capital Management Limited.